to welcome to another conversation on the China-MENA newsletter. I'm very happy today to have with me Camille Lons, who is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and the deputy head of the Paris office, which I have to assume is a pretty nice office to be working in. Camille just published a really great report back in May, and I highly recommend it to all of you because it's really, really useful. It's called East Meets Middle, China's Blossoming Relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Camille, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so I mean, I read this when it came out. I shared it on the newsletter, and I thought this would be a really good chance to, I always find when you write something like this, it's got a lot of momentum for a couple of weeks, and then it kind of dissipates very quickly. But with all of the hype or all of the discussion about China and the Middle East over the past, couple of months, it's always worth returning to this stuff. So my first question is, why did the ECFR want this policy brief? What is it about China? Why is Saudi and the UAE? What brought you to the topic?
Sure. I mean, the aim was to kind of do, first of all, a small update on the work we've been doing on China-MENA relations, because and you know very well, because you were one of the co-authors of that report that we published in 2019, which was looking at China in the broader MENA region. And a lot has been happening in the meantime. And this one is focusing more specifically, and I'll explain why, on Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So like the two kind of leading Gulf powers, and we thought that there was something interesting here. The aim for ECFR, there is always this angle also of explaining and trying to understand how that affects European interests, more specifically because a lot of the conversation is often produced by US think tank looking at US interest in the region. I think it's quite important as well for the Europeans to understand how that fits in their own radar and how that fits into their foreign policy towards the region and towards China. And so there's been a lot happening since the publication of the report in 2019 in terms of China's foreign policy priorities in the region and globally, in terms of the wider global context with the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and also the way China is approaching the region and its foreign policy in general. So I'll explain that. But first of all, like something that we see since the report in 2019 is that, first of all, China's a big leading element of China's role in the region was the BRI at the time. It was one of the top topics that everyone was looking at. And what we've seen in the past 5 years is quite a recalibration a little bit of the BRI and changing priorities in China's foreign policy. So, and we see that reflected in the MENA region. We've seen a lot of the Chinese investment and financing of infrastructure projects in the MENA region declining or plateauing, at least in most of the MENA countries. And we see, on the contrary, a shift from, I would say, hard infrastructure projects to new priorities, including the digital Silk Road, the kind of tech competition environment, but also a kind of big diplomatic offensive to promote alternative models of governance, etc. So China's regard towards the region has changed. The region itself has changed as well. And I think that I was mentioning the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. I think these two events have also, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a turning point, but at least an accelerating factor a little bit in the way some MENA powers look at the global order, look at the relationship with big powers like the US. So I think that was something interesting to get into the equation. And when we look at how China approaches the MENA region, I would argue as well that there is a change where China in the past was more looking at MENA as, I would say, a kind of a regional bloc. They have this regional forum, so like the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, the same way that they have the FOCAC for Africa. And I would say that they are increasingly shifting towards maybe a kind of middle powers diplomacy, where they refocus, they still look at the region as a bloc, but they also refocus their interest on key middle powers that have the ability to, play a role, a leading role in the region, but that also have a broader role in the international context, and that can be kind of pivotal players on the international scene. And so this is why I wanted to look specifically at the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because I think these are one of these middle powers that China is very interested in when it comes to the region. And they're quite unique, I would say, actors in the region, but even almost globally, in the sense that it's almost the only players that have that much financial firepower and kind of geoeconomic weight. I mean, not only they have the energy element, which we've seen with the Ukraine conflict is still a key geopolitical lever, but they have also this huge financial firepower. That means that they have the ability to deploy a capital in a way, a very flexible, quick, reactive manner that can, have impact in certain key strategic sectors. Where we've seen it in the tech and AI sector recently, which can be quite game-changing. Or if these countries decide or not to help a country bypass international sanctions, like we've seen it during the Ukraine conflict with Russia, or if they decide to, start trading oil in renminbi instead of dollars. I mean, not that it's happening, but just, they have the potential to really change quite significantly the international financial system. So like huge financial firepower. It's one of the countries also that are super close to the US, so they have access to sensitive tech from the US, especially defense tech. So in that sense, they're quite different from a player like Iran, which has been, disconnected from the US for quite some time. So they're both very close to the US, very powerful financially, and at the same time, very ready to question their relationship with the US and try to explore alternative partnerships with China. And so this is something that makes them, I think, quite interesting actors for China as well, because making inroads in countries that are traditional US partners that have access to US sensitive technologies is something interesting to China. And from the perspective of these countries, using that China card is something that gives them a lot of bargaining power when they negotiate their relationship with the US, which is what they're doing at the moment. So I think it was, I think it was interesting to explore the relationship with these specific countries and try to understand what that means, and what that means not only in the Middle East, but, because they have a broader role in the international system, like how this China Gulf relationship could have impacts also on broader questions on the international scene, including for European policymakers in terms of, as I said, like the role in the BRICS, the question of the international financial system, the question of also like what happens if there is an escalation in the Indo-Pacific, like what could be the role of these players. So all of these things, I think it was something interesting to understand better.
I want to come back in a couple of minutes to the US angle, but it's interesting when you talked about this as a follow-up to the 2019 report we wrote. I didn't really put it in that context. I didn't even think of that, but that's interesting just to think of when we wrote that report in 2019, it was still kind of a moment where people were saying, "Oh my God, China's in the Middle East. What does this mean? We don't really understand this as being a big thing yet." And just to think of everything that's happened in the 5 years since, it's really interesting. When you looked at the China UAE and China Saudi relationships, was there anything that really surprised you? Was there anything that was interesting in the findings that made you think that they were more or less substantive than maybe you thought going into the report?
Well, several things. The reason also why I wanted to look at both UAE and Saudi Arabia is that the approach of these two countries towards China is actually a little bit different, and I thought it was interesting to also understand that better. I would say that if we simplify a bit things, but the UAE has been much more willing to take risks and go a bit further in challenging their relationship with the US and deepening their relationship with China despite US pressures. And they've been playing that card much more than the Saudis have done to increase their margin of maneuver and their leverage. And sometimes maybe taking some risks. And I think this is something that the UAE is increasingly going to be confronted to in the context of greater great power competition between the US and China. They're increasingly confronted to this risk of crossing some red lines and taking the risk of harming the relationship with the US. And so they've been a bit more risk taker here than the Saudis that have been much more cautious, and that reflects, the broader Saudi foreign policy in general. They're a bigger power, so a bit more conservative in the way they do foreign policy, and we see that in the way they are negotiating currently the relationship with the US. I mean, the Saudis are very much engaged in that kind of grand bargain negotiation with the US, which we'll see where that goes, because there is currently the conflict plus the US elections upcoming, which are going to be like pose a lot of question marks on that relationship. But the China element is key, obviously, in that negotiation. And
You,
the sense, yeah.
I was just going to say, do you think when you look at the difference between the two and you bring the US angle into it, I mean, the UAE, I think I don't know if it's risk taking, because I think they've got a lot of capital in the bank with the US through things they've been cooperating with over the years. And I think that gives them a little more freedom to kind of push the boundaries. Whereas the Saudis, especially with the early Joe Biden administration, they came in from a position where that US relationship was in a pretty bad state. And I think they felt that they had to be a little more risk averse in approaching it to try to rebuild it. So I just have the sense that the Emiratis feel that they had just more space to kind of test where those lines are.
Probably, but still, I mean, I see them like doing things. It's not necessarily only with the US. Like, for example, I'm French, so from the French perspective, a couple of months ago, a bit more than that, I think 3 months ago, the UAE has been conducting joint military exercises with China in China using some French fighter jets, the Mirage. This is one of the things that has not made the Europeans very happy. And these are the kind of like, I wouldn't see, or maybe I'm mistaken, like I wouldn't see the Saudis taking this kind of risk, or same when the Emiratis, we have some rumors about some base, or at least we don't know exactly what it is, but some Chinese military activity around the port of Khalifa in the UAE. This is something on which the Saudis have been much more, cautious, and the Emiratis have been more, willing to kind of keep that ambiguity a bit more than the Saudis have. And this is not impacting only the US, obviously. I mean, the French have a base in the UAE as well and are very cautious of seeing what's happening there. So I agree with you. There is an element of the broader relationship with the US, especially under Biden administration. But I think this is also a trait of UAE foreign policy, because it doesn't happen only with China. Like, they're the ones that have done also the Abraham Accords with Israel. Like, it's a trait of like a smaller power that has more flexibility in their foreign policy.
Yeah, agree. I think you can see that across any number of issues where the UAE it's just they're a lot more nimble than a bigger country with Saudi, with that big population and lots of different competing factions or groups that have certain expectations of the state. It makes it a lot easier for the UAE to move a little quickly. I was kind of interested in your policy recommendations because I think that is the set of the bit of the paper that a lot of folks, I mean, you wrote this as a European for Europeans, but I think a lot of other countries can take a lot of this to heart. Do you want to just run us through a couple of things that you think are most relevant?
Sure. In terms of how the Europeans, like what the Europeans could do in reacting to that relationship, I mean, a few things. I think, like, first of all, for the Europeans, there is a need to what I'm calling for is for them to really understand what's happening here, because I think the US has been looking at what China was doing in the Middle East and everywhere in the world much earlier, and this is a a key topic for them. The Europeans are taking a bit more time to really realize what's going on, and what one of the main points of the paper is to say that it's almost less about what China really is doing in the region, because I'm also highlighting all the uh, limits of that relationship with Gulf countries. And sometimes we tend to exaggerate quite a lot what China is really doing. But what I think is important is less what China is doing, is more what that means, how the regional countries are using that relationship, and what that means in the way they think about how they position themselves in the broader global context, how they think about their long-term relationship with Western powers. And I think this is where the Europeans need to be quite cautious of understanding that these countries now have other partners that are not Western partners, that they look at the evolution of the international uh, system, and they see their place there. And so this is where the Europeans have to be a bit cautious and take that more into consideration. That would mean, in practical terms, understanding what are the key areas where this is impacting our interests. So, like in critical technologies, for example, or like in the defense sector, as I said. And in that case, putting some clear red lines to where, to make clear to these partners where our interests can be impacted and how we need to protect that. But the Europeans don't have the leverage that the US has. So we can't stop China from being influential in that region. It would be unrealistic and not even like very productive. And but what is a better way to address this question maybe is to think more positively on, like, what is it that we bring to that region that creates an alternative, especially in the context of US-China rivalry, and where these countries are trying to find alternative players, like how the Europeans can be an alternative partner. How can we also work on relations with other like-minded Asian powers and create sort of like triangular relations where we help, again, these Gulf countries diversify their partnerships, diversify their economic relations. That can fit even in Europe's own de-risking strategy towards China, because we're looking at de-risking our supply chains. And so if we invest a bit more in Gulf countries' economies and their own efforts to diversify their economies and position themselves as alternative hubs for re-exports or manufacturing, that can participate in de-risking, so in our own de-risking strategy towards China. And yes, and trying to work with other Asian partners like the Indians, like the IMEC project was an attempt to do that. It's confronted to a lot of challenges at the moment, but I think this is an interesting way to go forward and position ourselves in this kind of broader map of changing relations across the world.
Yeah, I was happy when I saw IMEC at the back end of the recommendations, because this is a drum I keep beating is, there's always this kind of great power narcissism where it's China and it's the US, and the rest of us are kind of relegated to not being very active participants. But when I just being here in Abu Dhabi and seeing the role that India plays, that Korea plays, that Japan plays, you can see a lot of Indo-Pacific powers that have big problems with China and deep interests here. And you can see, where I wouldn't, maybe coalition's the wrong word, but you can see just a socialization where the EU could work with like-minded countries to say, look, we have a lot to offer, and it can when it's bundled together, offer a lot of bang for its buck. One of the things I thought in the recommendation section, you write about, I think correctly, that China's influence isn't going away, that you have to recognize this and work with it, and that there's opportunity possibly for the Europe to coordinate with China. And you mentioned issues like non-proliferation, maritime security, regional stability. Just looking at what's happened since you started writing this and since it was published, would you take maybe a more jaundiced view of this if you were writing it today? Because it seems China hasn't really seemed very interested in kind of working with Western preferences on some of these issues. They seem to be pretty content to watch Western countries dangle and expose their maybe the limitations of what we can do in the region. So yeah, I was just wondering what you thought of that section, if it might be worth revisiting.
No, I mean, you're very right to point that element. And actually, that's one point of debate amongst Europeans, because, the problem is that Europeans don't share a very common approach to China. They're, increasingly towards a more, not hawkish, but like, the systemic rival elements of the relationship between Europe and China is becoming more important now in the European narrative. But you see still like important differences between obviously like French, Germans, some like more Eastern European countries or Southern ones. And that doesn't help having like a common approach to China. And on that specific front, you have some voices that still want to explore areas where it's possible to cooperate with China. And one element recently during the Red Sea attacks was the Red Sea crisis, was to see whether China, which depends quite heavily on maritime traffic in that area, could be a partner, or at least a power that we could engage with on these issues, and try to see if there is a shared interest here in maintaining stability in that region. But there is a growing debate also that says that basically that assumption that we had for some time, that China has a deep interest in stability in general because it allows it to, to make business everywhere, and so it's in favor of stability. That assumption might not be completely true anymore, and that in certain cases, as we're seeing right now in the Red Sea crisis, it is ready to accommodate a certain level of instability when that instability incurs costs to the US and to its rivals that are much higher to the cost that it is receiving on its end. So yes, Chinese companies are impacted by current instability in the Red Sea, but they consider that all the other companies are also impacted anyways, and that they even have some Chinese maritime companies that are taking advantage of the fact that they're not being targeted by the Houthis to take advantage commercially from the situation. Although I would say that it's probably quite limited. The big ones, like the ones that matter, like POSCO, or bypassing the area. But there is this idea that right now the current crisis is harming so much, U.S. image globally and in the region, that it's okay for China not to step in and let things, go as it is, and not try too much to solve the situation. And so that's indeed the debate, like to what extent should we, as Europeans, consider China as a partner that really shares a similar interest. It's quite complicated, obviously, on maritime security. We won't be able to cooperate really with China the way that we tried before. I mean, I think it was in 2015 or 14 that NATO did some joint anti-piracy exercises with China in this area. Now, in the current context, it wouldn't be a possibility. And so I think it's important for Europeans to be very realistic of where China positions itself, because by trying to engage China in this and show that we are trying to talk to China, it gives China credibility and legitimacy on the international scene. without getting anything in return from China when it comes to trying to stabilize that region. So this is a tricky one here. I think it's always useful to keep at least a dialogue open with China on what's happening, but maybe being very realistic in terms of what China's interests are here.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I've always said, China's preferences are for stability and its interests are primarily economic. And to the point you were just making, I think you see China has been using the region a little cavalierly, in my opinion, to play geopolitics over the past year or so. And it was funny because as I was reading your report again, I reread it this weekend to prep for this. I had this thought that I could imagine an American think tank writing a similar report 15 years ago about China and Europe and saying, look at all the stuff China and Europe are doing together, and what does this mean for us? And then you see the same dynamic where China starts using European affairs to make points, which really shifted the narrative on how European countries start to think about China. And I wonder if the same risk might apply here because Gulf countries, Middle Eastern countries are very attuned to how extra-regional powers are playing in the region to try to achieve something. And I think they're very aware that China has not been an especially helpful actor in a lot of things that they consider nearly existential. And I wonder if that's going to affect the way leaders in the region look at China.
No, yes, absolutely. I mean, but I think that there's been really a learning curve on the side of regional powers because I remember, and it's still there to some extent, but there was 10 years ago when the BRI was launched, quite important expectations from regional countries in terms of what China would do. But it was coming also from the fact that they didn't know China very well. So they could dream about all these things that China could do with them because they had not interacted that much with the Chinese. And 10 years later, they have interacted much more with the Chinese politically, on the security side, on the business to business kind of level as well. And I feel that they're kind of, recalibrating a bit their expectations from China, definitely. And yes, I think they're quite realistic in terms of what China can bring to the region. And when it comes to, for example, the Saudis asking China to mediate the rapprochement with Iran in 2023, I mean, that was also not because the Saudis trusted China at all, but because in my reading of the thing, it's because they didn't trust China that much about its relationship with Iran that they wanted to hold China a bit more accountable of what it was doing in the region and use a bit more its political levers towards a country like Iran. So I think that's kind of reflective of the way they've evolved in their view of China. And I think that the recent developments is kind of confirming also that to them the fact that China has been very hands-off in the current Middle Eastern crisis. We're not expecting, like nobody is really expecting China to play a key role, and the crisis has really, even if regional powers are in how to say very critical of the U.S. positioning and the U.S. support to Israel in this conflict, they look at who is the big power coming and able to deploy ships on the ground and able to protect Israel from huge attacks from Iran. And this is the kind of protection that they want. So at the end of the day, some analysts have said that the current conflict was kind of eroding U.S. Soft power in the region, and on the contrary, making China appear on the right side of history. I would be a bit more nuanced on that assessment. Yes, it erodes definitely U.S. Soft power in the region, but in terms of considering who is the big power that has the ability to provide real security guarantees, it kind of reinforces the calculus of countries on that. And that's why the Saudis are so keen to try to negotiate that grand bargain deal with the US. And the UAE is also doing kind of the same negotiation at the same time. So
There's a lot there, but I can see the thing is flashing on my Zoom that I've got like a minute left before it gets shut off. Camille, thanks so much for this. I'm going to promote the report, and also I'll add the link to the 2019 one as well. Really recommend everybody reads them because they're really, really useful. And I will also say you created an excellent cliffhanger by talking about the Saudi calculus on the China-Iran-Saudi rapprochement, because tomorrow's video is an Iranian scholar looking at that exact deal from that perspective of what was Iran thinking. So this is synergy. Nice.
Great. Looking forward to listening to it.
Cool. Well, Camille, thanks so much for
Thank
this.
you.
It's really appreciate it.
Thank you.